The Falchion, typically a light, one-handed cutting-focused sword, which can be a heck of a lot of fun to use. Hello, this is Kyle, also known as AlienTude, and today I'm going to be reviewing this Sterling Armory Falchion, which is on loan to me by Matthew Cross. Thanks, Matthew. So, Sterling Armory. Now, I've done a review of one of their swords before. Check up here for the link. They're based out of Florida, and Chris Fields is the owner and primary bladesmith there. He made this sword for Matthew Cross, and I picked it up for Matthew at Combat Con. He's letting me review it before shipping it on to him. This Falchion would have cost $970 brand new. Now, before diving into the nitty-gritty about this sword, I'd like to invite you to check out my merch store at www.alientude.com. 25% of the profits of every sale will be donated to the American Cancer Society. Thanks for your support. Now, I haven't talked about falchions on this channel before. Instead of the oak-shot typology that would normally be used for the standard double-edged European swords, we have the Elmslie typology, which I will put on the screen right here. This was developed by Mr. James Elmslie. Judging by that, I believe this would classify as a Type 3C falchion with a Type F hilt. There are some misconceptions about falchions that are fairly popular these days. One of those being that these were anti-armor weapons. They are absolutely not. A falchion was, generally speaking, a light cutter, not a heavy chopper, and they would be pretty much useless against any metal armor. These would be mostly used against unarmored people or people with just textile armor, in which case the narrow blade and excellent edge geometry should make them to be excellent cutters. Something else I would say is often a misconception is that these were the weapons of peasants. I think that's wildly inaccurate, especially when you look at some of these historical finds, which are just extravagantly decorated. There's no way that's a peasant weapon. In fact, rather than peasantry weapons, these were often probably the weapons of nobility to be used against peasants, because peasants oftentimes did not have metal armor. They would have textile armor, like a gambeson or akaton or something like that. And a dedicated cutting sword is actually very useful against those. Now, unfortunately, there aren't a whole lot of historical falchions still existing today. I believe there's less than 2 dozen. I could be wrong about that. But they are all over medieval artwork, so I think they were probably more common, and just through the vagaries of chance, we don't have very many existing anymore. So taking a look at the hilt, let's start with the pommel as usual. The pommel is made of bronze, and it's actually got a good amount of patina on it already, which is kind of interesting since this is a new sword. I would personally prefer to see this a little bit more polished right off the bat, but that wouldn't be very hard to do, and the patina is not necessarily a bad thing. All the edges are chamfered nicely. There's absolutely no hot spots anywhere on the pommel, and this little recess, I think a very small coin would actually look really good in there. There is some dimension to it. It starts a little bit thicker here where it meets the guard, and then the center section kind of tapers just a little bit, just enough to give it some more depth when you're looking close at it. It is peened to the tang, and the peen has been shaped some, but it's a little bit sloppy. There's some marks here, and actually right up here, you can see some hammer marks in the bronze itself. So a few errant hammer marks, but it's not bad. The grip is, like most European swords, wood core, leather wrap, cord texture. It's got a riser on each end. All of this is very well defined. The risers are beautifully crisp, and there is a seam right here, and there's absolutely no hot spots on the seam, unlike on my Sterling Armory sword where I had a very small hot spot. This one doesn't have any. It's dyed this beautiful blue color. I personally love blue for grips, and this one looks great. The shape is kind of a flattened oval. The planes here are pretty flat, and then they round around the other edges, and it leads to a grip that is just very, very easy to index the blade and very comfortable to use. The transitions from the grip to the pommel and to the crossguard, absolutely perfect. The crossguard is made of stainless steel. Mr. Fields does this because he lives in Florida and a lot of his customers are Floridians, and it's so humid there that non-stainless steel, something that can rust easily, it rusts very easily on a crossguard. So he uses stainless. There's a good amount of dimension to this crossguard. It starts nice and thick here and then tapers all the way down to the tips of the quillins. And there's a lot of dimension actually to the shape here. There's a center ridge that kind of flares out and then kind of tapers back in. It's kind of hard to describe. Hopefully you can see that. And the gap in the crossguard is quite small. Now it's not uniform. There's some bits where there's a little bit of gaps, but that's due to the shaping of the blade. You know, this is not a symmetrical blade. It's thicker at the spine and obviously very thin at the edge. And now it's time to talk about the business end, the blade. As always, here's my measurements. So as you can see, this sword has a lot of distal taper. It starts very thick right here at the crossguard and tapers very evenly right to about 2/3 of the way up the blade, where it gets much, much thinner very aggressively. And then it tapers again down and then actually does reinforce a little bit at the tip. This leads to a blade that is got a little bit of flex out towards the tip, as you would expect, but it's mostly pretty stiff, which means it should make for a very effective cutter. We'll get to that in a minute. Now the finish on this blade is a satin, but there's quite a few tool markings still on a variety of places. I'll put some pictures up as I'm describing the sword, and you can see that. The fullers run very straight, although there is definitely some rippling in them, and they do end mostly at the same place on both sides. And past the fullers, there's a ridge right here where the primary bevel starts. And this ridge kind of wanders around a little bit. It's definitely not perfectly straight. You can definitely tell it was handmade that way. Like every other sword from Sterling Armory I've seen, the first couple inches are not only not sharpened, but they are very thick. And this is just something that Mr. Fields does, aesthetic choice, a choice he makes. He does let you finger the guard. I don't know how common that would be on a falchion, but if you want to, it is an option. Now, speaking of this area, right where it starts getting sharp, there's some flaws in the finish here. It's kind of got like this almost like pattern of black and alternating black and not, which I don't really know what to make of. It's right here, and then there's another spot on the false edge where it does this also. It's kind of distracting when looking at the sword a little bit, because every now and then it catches the light in a way and you see these slight flaws in the finish, but it's not like it affects the performance of the sword at all. So speaking of that false edge, it starts kind of right where the thickness of the spine starts narrowing a lot, and it gets to the point where it's not sharpened, but it's very close. I don't think it would take very much time at all to get this up to the point where you could really cut with it. So let's take a look at how sharp the sword is with some paper cutting. I'm just going to insert it in and then let the sword slide through it. Very, very sharp actually. Basically no effort there and perfectly smooth cuts. The sword is very, very sharp, which, as I understand it, my friend Matthew requested an extra sharp sword from Mr. Fields, and looks to me like he delivered. So let's take a look at some cutting footage. So this sword cuts water bottles extremely well, but how does it handle tatami? I'd say it handles tatami very well also, especially considering this was only the second sword I've ever cut tatami with, and it just sliced through it with pretty much no effort at all. This falchion handles amazingly well. Every time I go to pick it up, a little involuntary ooh comes out of me because it just feels so good in the hand. It has the perfect amount of authority in the cut, the perfect balance point to just feel incredibly agile and alive in the hand. It just feels so good to use. It's really hard to explain just how good this feels to use. You just saw my cutting. That was easily my best cutting session with a single-handed sword, probably with any sword ever. I had a good number of silent cuts on the little water bottles, which I never get. And this sword just made it so easy. It's just so easy to use, so easy to get the edge alignment right, easy to put the right amount of power in while not just blowing through the bottles. Just fun to use. It's the best way I can put it is it just feels amazing and fun to use. Let's take a look. So it's a pretty stiff blade, has very little wobble to it, has a good amount of flex right at the sweet spot, which makes sense because the blade starts so nice and thick and tapers, and then right where it's not a false edge here yet, but right here it starts tapering very aggressively into a much thinner edge, which is generally what falchions should do. At the sweet spot, they generally were quite thin because they were dedicated cutting swords, and the thinner the blade is, the easier it is to cut through. So you have to balance that with enough stiffness to not just make it, when it impacts, to just wobble around and not cut. And this falchion does it perfectly. This is amazing. I can't stress enough just how much fun this was to use. One of the other things that's really nifty, I guess you could say, about Sterling Armory swords, I'm sure you heard it in that cutting, the ringing sound. Every time this sword cuts, anytime any Sterling Armory sword I've used cuts, when it impacts, it just lets out that beautiful ring. And that's due to the way Sterling Armory puts their hilts together. They actually compress the crossguard onto the blade a little bit to make a really secure fit. And that ring lets them, you know, that the sword, the hilt construction is super tight. It's a nice little good sound, like just a little flick and you get that ring. I don't know if it's going to be picked up on the microphone, but it sounds good. It's just a nice little, nice bonus, I guess you will. But moving this sword around, it's nimble, but it's not so nimble that you feel like it can't cut. You saw the cutting, it can cut very well. And it's so lively. It feels like I can put it wherever I want it, with almost no effort. I'm gushing here, I know. I feel like I'm not even giving any good information because I'm just geeking out about how good this sword is. But maybe that should tell you something, you know. Typically I am much more of a longsword guy. I like using both hands. This is the first not arming sword, this is a falchion, but this is the first single-handed sword I've used that I just love using, to the point where I wish it was mine. Matthew Cross has let me do this review. I'm going to have to send it to him, and it's going to be a shame to see it go. So now it's time to talk bottom line. Is this sword worth the $970 price tag? Well, if you watched my handling portion, I think you know my answer. Yes, this sword is worth it. I absolutely love this sword. I wish it was mine. I am so sad I have to send it to my friend Matthew, because if I could, I would keep this and use it all the time. It is just so much fun to use and such a great sword. It's absolutely worth the $970 price tag. And I like it so much that I know at some point I'm going to buy a falchion from Sterling Armory because I love this sword so much. And that's going to wrap up this review. Thanks for watching, and thank you to Matthew Cross for allowing me to review his new sword. Until next time, Alien Toot out.